In the Torah reading of Shmini this week, we read about a very tragic story that happened on the day that the temple was inaugurated in the desert. Two of Aaron's 4 children go into the temple, offer offerings that they weren't supposed to, and they both died there. A tragedy of enormous proportion. And the Torah tells us that Aaron was silent. He accepted God's decree. And as a reward for this, God spoke to him directly in the next communication to the Jewish people. Usually God would speak to Moses. Moses would then pass on the information to Aaron and to the Jewish people. In this case, God spoke directly to Aaron. His silence opened him up to a new revelation of God. Silence is a very interesting word, especially this week. The Jewish people just commemorated yesterday International Remembrance Day for the Holocaust, Yom Hashoah. And we all know that 75, 80 years ago, when the Second World War was going on, the world was silent. Vayidom, the world remained silent. Some did it happily, some did it reluctantly. Some would have loved to say something and do something, but they felt we can't interfere, political reasons, whatever it was. The common denominator between all of them was their silence. And that silence destroyed Europe, destroyed the world. Aaron's silence, on the other hand, built the world. You see, I want to contrast these two types of silence. In the case of Aaron, I want to tell you a story. Eli Wiesel came to the Rebbe once in 1963, I believe it was, and he spent hours by the Rebbe in his room. And he was crying over the Holocaust. He asked the Rebbe, how could Hashem, Allah, God, allowed such a thing to happen? And the Rebbe told him, how could we ask that question? What do we know about God? How could we, our minds are so small, tiny, how can it fathom the mysteries of the infinite God? It's impossible. The Rebbe encouraged him and told him, and made reference to Aaron and his sons. Vayidom, sometimes you have to remain silent. But don't become inactive. That silence shouldn't lead you to depression. On the contrary, it should lead you to build God. The Rebbe encouraged them to get married, build a family. That would be the best response to Hitler. And he went ahead and did that. So you see, there's there's different types of silence. One is a silence that comes from a point of strength, from a point of faith. Aaron, the Jews, the survivors of the Holocaust that came and rebuilt their lives, they were silent in one respect. They accepted God's decree. What do we know? What do we understand? And they went on to build and take that faith and that resolve and create a new world. Look at Israel. But the silence that was going on during the war, that was an egregious sin. It's unforgivable. That's a silence that destroys worlds. May God help that the world should never be silent again in the face of such atrocities. Imagine someone says, who are we, and for religious reasons, I'm going to interfere in God's world, in the ways of God? Who am I to interfere? That would be an egregious sin. Such silence would destroy the world. That was the sin of the world during the time of the Holocaust. And just to scream at the top of your lungs when atrocities are happening is also a small virtue. You have to do something, not just scream. So what does never again mean? Never again means we'll never be silent in the face of atrocities, in the face of injustices. We'll never allow anti-Semites to raise their ugly head, whether they're in college campuses, whether they're in government, whether they're anywhere else in the world. But the silence of Aaron is a silence that builds worlds. I want to tell you on a personal note, my grandparents, my father's parents, both perished during the Holocaust. My father came here in 1950 with a shirt on his back. He was silent. What could he say? Well, how can he question God? But he went on to build. Between his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, we number, thank God, I don't know the exact number, but it's over 250 souls. May my parents continue to live. With their silence, they built a world. That's the silence of Aaron. That's the silence of strength. That's the silence of resolve. That's the silence of faith. That's the silence that opens you up to a revelation of God, a direct communication with God. But the world The world's silence is the worst mark that they have carrying on their foreheads, a mark that they have to atone for. And may God help that the world should get atonement, learn the lessons, never be silent again, and help the world rebuild. And ultimately, may we merit that we should be reunited with the 6 million and with the many more millions of the past history of the Jewish people who perished in acts of anti-Semitism and violence and so on. With the coming of Mashiach, may it happen now. Shabbat Shalom.